If Australians fully realise the degree to which politicians have caused or exacerbated most of the major problems the nation faces, there would be rioting in the streets. The streets of our major cities would resemble the recent scenes in France if there was a full appreciation of the way politicians create problems, fail to enact solutions to serious problems, and/or create legislation that makes a serious problem worse. Everyone with a mortgage is paying massively higher monthly costs because the federal government has taken no action to address rising inflation, leaving it to the Reserve Bank to use the dumb, blunt instrument of lifting interest rates to try to fix the problem. Households across Australia are dealing with massive increases in energy costs because politicians have messed up the electricity supply system. We've had royal commissions into multiple core issues, including aged care, the behaviour of the big banks, deaths in custody, and many other issues, and there's no evidence of improvement in any of those areas. Housing affordability has been a massive issue for decades, and there have been multiple government inquiries, but the problem continues to get worse. The rental shortage crisis has been building for years, and not only do politicians have no solutions, but every time they pass laws that impact on real estate markets, they make it considerably worse. Now think about that for a moment. We want our elected representatives to find ways to make housing more affordable, and we want them to fix the rental shortage. But every time they make a decision or pass a law, they make the situation worse. Politicians fundamentally have caused these problems, and they continue to make them worse. Right now, governments around Australia at a state and territory level are implementing changes to the rules of dwelling construction, which add yet again to the cost of building new dwellings. And this continues the recent history of changes which collectively have added massively to the cost of new home. At the same time, multiple governments are making changes to tenancy laws which are favourable to tenants while being onerous to property owners. This also is a continuation of recent years with regular and repeated changes to the rules which have been detrimental to the property owners. Increasingly, they have made property ownership onerous, and many discouraged investors have sold or decided not to get into the market. And that, in simple terms, has caused the rental shortage crisis. In Queensland, the state government has brought in a new construction code, which will add $70,000 to the cost of building a new home. The New South Wales government is making changes to tenancy laws in that state, which will be favourable to tenants and again onerous to property owners. And it's already passed new laws trying to limit rent increases, but the so-called Rental Fairness Bill will make matters worse, not better. The New South Wales government has also appointed a state regional commissioner whose job is to empower renters, which means another assault on the rights of the people who own the properties that people rent. The New South Wales government has also introduced a new tax on developers called the Housing and Productivity Contribution, which is yet another tax on the housing industry, which adds to the cost of creating new homes. And the research shows that in New South Wales, up to 50% of the cost of a new house and land package is government taxes, fees and charges. And it keeps getting worse. A new government report shows that Victoria already has the highest property taxes in Australia, and they're set to get worse with the recent state budget bringing in a massive increase in land tax. They've also recently increased stamp duty on some property buyers. And now the Victorian state government says it's going to bring in rental caps, which will prevent property owners from increasing their rents except once every 2 years, which the Real Estate Institute of Victoria says is nonsensical and disastrous and will lead to homelessness because it will cause property owners to sell up and get out of Victoria. Queensland also has tried to bring on a massive increase in land tax to be paid by property owners. They failed in that attempt, but the attempt alone scared off property investors and added to the state's chronic rental shortage. New research has found that Queensland's failed land tax reform caused serious long-term damage to the state's stock of rental properties. MCG Quantity Surveyors Managing Director Mike Mortlock says analysis of data for over 1,300 clients showed that investors had fled the market in droves after the Queensland government announced in June last year that land tax will be calculated on a property owner's entire Australian portfolio, not just property held in Queensland. Now, this controversial proposal was ultimately shelved in September last year after pushback from other states who refused to supply data to Queensland to implement the tax. But it's not just state governments. Local councils also have jumped on the let's demonise investors and hit them with new taxes bandwagon. Local authorities, including Brisbane City Council and Hobart City Council, have seen an opportunity to raise even more revenue from the housing industry while pretending to be doing something to solve the rental crisis. They're slugging property owners who use short-term letting with massive increases in rates. Brisbane City Council has gone overboard and is conducting a full frontal assault on anyone who uses short-term strategies with their properties, treating it as being akin to a criminal activity. In reality, it's just an excuse to raise extra revenue for new taxes, but that's what politicians typically do. Local authorities are also preventing the construction of affordable housing because they don't want increased density. In other words, the NIMBY syndrome is preventing solutions to the housing shortage from being implemented. And one of the Perth councils, the City of Subiaco, recently brought in new sustainability policies for new dwellings to get approval, which will add a further $20,000 to the cost of building new dwellings. And meanwhile, at a federal level, the federal government has been unable to implement its $10 billion social housing fund to deal with the housing crisis because the Greens are blocking it. And we have the ATO conducting an assault on property investment owners, which is based on the assumption that all investors are crooks ripping off the system, with each of us considered guilty until proven innocent. Now, the only politician right across Australia who has said or done anything sensible about the rental shortage crisis is the Federal Housing Minister, Julie Collins. Speaking on ABC News Breakfast in June, she said that it was nonsense to demand that the federal government create a cap on rentals because they don't have the power to do so. She said, everybody knows the Commonwealth doesn't have the power to cap rents, and she's absolutely right. And she says, even if the government did have that capacity, we have data and evidence that rent caps don't work and it puts downward pressure on supply. And she said, what we need to do is add to supply. Well, exactly. We need to increase the supply of dwellings, and the federal government's trying to, but the Greens are blocking the legislation in the Senate because they want rental caps. The Greens, let's face it, are the worst representation of the problems that politicians cause instead of creating solutions. They want to bring in rental caps, scrap negative gearing, and massively increase the capital gains tax. Now, they did all of that in Ireland, and that country now has the world's worst situation for people who need to rent. Australia has a rental shortage crisis, but Ireland has an absolute catastrophe with close to zero vacancies because they did what the Greens want to do in Australia.